What I want to do in this video is just quickly explain why the way I've been presenting Russell's theory, it really is a good way to think about Russell's theory. Because the way I presented it is much simpler, as you'll see. So we're thinking about sentences of the form, the F is G. And in my presentation of Russell's theory, what that means is something like, there is exactly one thing which is F, and it is also G. That was my presentation of Russell's theory. But as you'll remember in the text itself, he presents this in a much more complicated way. What he says is, the F is G means there is something, call it O, which is F and G, and anything which is F is identical to O, the thing which is F and G. So this is the way I presented Russell's theory, this is the way Russell himself presents the theory. But as a matter of fact, these two things actually really say the same thing. It takes a little while to see that. It's not really easy to get your head around. What essentially is going on is, so I use this word exactly. And this whole piece of Russell's own formulation is just a more logically explicit, slightly more complicated way of saying exactly. Because, this part, there is one thing which is F and is also G. Well, that's what Russell is saying here. The only difference is that where I have exactly, Russell has this, and anything which is F is identical to O piece. But it turns out that these actually mean the same thing. So I just want to quickly give you some justification for doing that, because obviously it's much nicer to think about the theory this way. It's much more complicated to think about it that way. But I want to assure you that they do come to the same thing. So we'll think about a particular kind of example and see why in that example that they come to the same thing. But the reasoning that I'm going to use is going to generalize. It won't be specific to that case. It will work in any kind of case. So rather than just the F is G, let's imagine a claim like, the car outside is red. What does that say on my formulation, according to Russell? It says there's exactly one thing, which is a car outside. And that thing is also red. What does it say on Russell's own formulation of his view? It says there's exactly one thing, which is a car outside, and red, and anything else which is a car outside is identical to that first thing, the car outside. So for this particular sentence, that's the two different versions of Russell's theory. This is the way I'm saying it, this is the way Russell himself says it. And what we're going to show is that in this particular example, they say the same thing. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to think, this might be a little bit counterintuitive, but it is actually easier than doing it the other way around. We're going to show that they say the same thing by showing that they're false in exactly the same situations. Whenever this is false, and vice versa. When that is false, that is also false. That's another way of showing that they say the same thing. Because if they're false in all the same situations, well then they're going to have to be true in all the same situations as well. Because the situation where it's true is just one where it's not false. So we don't need this anymore, I'm just going to get rid of it. So let's think about all the possible situations where this claim might be false. The claim, there's exactly one thing, which is a car outside, and it's red. One situation is just where there are no cars outside. Because if there's no car outside, well, there can't be exactly one thing, which is a car outside and red, because there just are no cars outside. The second way for this to be false is if there is exactly one car outside, but it's not red. It's pretty clear why the sentence is false in that situation. And then the last situation where this is false is where there's more than one car outside. Because if you're saying there's exactly one thing which is a car outside and it's also red, but there's more than one car outside, then this bit, which says there is more than one thing which is a car outside, that has to be false. So these are the three situations in which this sentence is false. It's false when there's no car outside, it's false when there's exactly one car outside, but it's not red, and it's also false when there's just more than one car outside. Because if this says there is a unique car outside, well, that has to be false when there's more than one. What we're now going to argue is that the second way, Russell's way of putting the theory, is also false in exactly all of these situations. So remember what it says. There is something, O, which is a car outside, it's red, and anything else which is a car outside is identical to O. I think why it's false in the first two situations is hopefully easy enough to see. If there's no car outside, well then this first bit is false. There isn't anything O, which is a car outside. So there's nothing which is a car outside in red. So in the first situation, this is false. What about when there's exactly one car outside and it's not red? Well, if there's exactly one thing that's a car outside and it's not red, well then there isn't something which is a car outside and red. Now there is something which is a car outside, but it's not also red. So again, the first conjunct here, the first line, is false in the second situation. Let's now take the final situation. This is the trickiest one to think about. So we've got a situation where there's more than one car outside. In a situation like that, well, maybe we have car A, and we have car B. Now, the crucial thing to note is that, well, when you've got a situation with two cars outside, well, A and B can't be identical. I mean, literally identical. Because if they were literally identical, well, then there would just be one car. If there's going to be two cars, they have to be distinct. So in this situation, since we're saying that there are two cars, A and B have to be different cars. So it can't be... So in this situation, we know that A does not equal B. They're different objects. But remember what this says. It says that there's something which is a car outside in red, and anything else which is a car outside is identical to O. So let's imagine that A is red. So it's true that there's something which is a car outside in red, but is it true that anything else which is a car outside is identical to A? And the answer is no, because we have this other car, B. And as we said, if there are supposed to be two cars, then B must not be identical to A. And this is the more general thing, is that when you have a situation where there's more than one car outside, then it's just not going to be true that anything else which is a car outside is identical to the first one. Because if there are two of them, then they must be distinct and so not identical. And so this is basically why this longer sentence using the notion of identity is a longer, more spelled out way of saying exactly. Because whenever you have two things which have a certain property, like the property of being a car outside, it's not true of either of them that anything else which has that property is identical to the first one. It's not true that anything else which is a car outside is identical to A, because there's B. And it's not true of B that anything else which is a car outside is identical to B, because there's A. If there's two cars, they just must not be identical to each other. So it sort of takes a while to explain, and it is kind of tricky to get your head around. But that is essentially why these are two different versions of the same theory. This longer phrase, anything else which is a car outside is identical to O, which is very hard to say, it turns out to be basically just a longer way of saying exactly. And the key to seeing that is by thinking through this case. Now, obviously, thinking about it in terms of exactly is much more intuitive, it's much more easy to say, and so that is why we're going to think about the theory in the way that I presented it and not the way that Russell presented it, because it just removes unnecessary complications. But the complications are unnecessary because when you think about it, the two ways of saying the theory actually come out to the same thing. They say the same thing, even though one is harder to understand than the other.